Subjects in our experiment were seated at a card table in a quiet, darkened room with the illuminated meter before them. In a control room about 50 feet away, separated from the experimental room by two walls and a hallway, the researchers communicated by intercom, giving whatever instructions were needed. The subject's first task was to reduce muscle tension to very low levels as indicated by the meter. Then the meter was turned off and the subject was asked to imagine a physical exercise such as rowing a boat while trying to stay relaxed. After 15 seconds, the experimenter said over the intercom, "Now you may stop visualizing. When the meter is turned on, please reduce the muscle tension to as low as the level possible before the next trial." After about 30 seconds of feedback, the meter was turned off again, and the second trial began with another phrase, such as now imagine that you are climbing a rope hand over hand. With the feedback meter turned off during the visualizations, the subject could not be certain whether muscle tension was involved. One purpose in alternating the tension trials and relaxation trials was to get the muscle tension to very low levels before each visualization so that the minute changes in tension could be detected. When muscles are tense, small changes cannot be detected. Several subjects succeeded in reducing muscle tension so remarkably that I felt something was wrong with our recording machinery. At certain moments, our polygraph recorded indicated zero tension. From my study of neuroanatomy, I did not believe that it was possible to have no tension in a muscle, yet this was what the record said. In addition, a rhythmic firing pattern indicated by a sawtooth wave at 7 spikes per second was, I thought, due to some unusual malfunction in our electronic machinery. The presence of these sawtooth records brought the experiment to a halt. Dale Walters and I spent 3 weeks in a high-gain oscilloscope troubleshooting every wire and piece of equipment. An oscilloscope is essentially the same thing as a television set, except that you can examine many electrical signals and not merely the signal from a television broadcast station. Eventually, I was convinced that the 7 spikes per second phenomenon was actually originating from the subjects. What could it be? When I first reported this finding to Gardner Murphy, he too was surprised and puzzled. One of the other researchers in the department bluntly said, "I don't believe it." Whenever a scientist is confronted with such a situation, his next step, contrary to popular opinion, is usually to search the scientific literature in depth. Scientists are sometimes portrayed as people who know almost everything about what they are doing before they do it, but this is generally not the case. I found a book written by John Basmajian, Muscles Alive, 1962, in which he described a muscular firing pattern called single motor unit firing, or SMU firing. He made a reference to 2 previous investigators who had also noticed this phenomenon. He pointed out that with the help of visual and auditory feedback, it was possible for a person to reduce the tension in a muscle to levels far below what had previously been thought possible. He explained that the usual medical idea that muscles could not become relaxed was due to misinterpretation of research reports. He also mentioned that when the nerve supplying a muscle was cut, researchers found not a cessation of muscle firing, but instead spontaneous muscle firing that was considerably higher than zero tension. In order to pick up SMU, or single motor unit firing, with a large surface electrode, it is necessary for all the muscle fibers that can be detected by the electrode, perhaps several thousand of them, to remain still, except for the group connected with one single nerve cell. Each nerve cell that triggers muscle acts as a tiny electrical activator and is usually attached to a number of muscle fibers. Whenever the single nerve cell fibers on command from somewhere in the central nervous system, it activates the group of muscle fibers attached to it. We might think of the nerve fiber as a twig of to which we are attached many leaves, which each leaf a single muscle fiber, and in the entire group of leaves a single motor unit. Tension in a muscle bundle, which maybe consists of thousands of motor units, is controlled partly by the firing rate in individual nerve fibers and partly by the total number of nerve fibers that are firing. As already mentioned, it is possible for a person to learn to control one single nerve fiber in a bundle of nerve fibers. Basmajian gave the name single motor unit geniuses, which he shortened to SMUGs, to those who could control the SMUs, or single motor units. Approximately half of his subjects were able to accomplish it. Basmajian was one of them. Interestingly, no one who can control single motor unit firing can describe how it is done. All that can be said is that you visualize what you want to have happen and then the body does it. The feedback helps you get a feeling for the process so that you can repeat it, but it doesn't help you explain in words how it is done. The Bashmajan's research, each pulse of the single motor unit firing was heard on the loudspeaker as a thump, and he could soon notice that with auditory feedback, a person could learn to control the thumping pattern. For instance, if it was desired to hear thump thump followed by thump 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 thump, quite often it would happen. People found that they could manufacture doublets, triplets, and drum rolls at will. The important point of the research was the fact that single cells were being controlled by volition. This fact is remarkably significant. From a medical point of view, the ability to develop conscious control of a single nerve cell was theoretical consequences that extended through all biofeedback research, whether in the domain of voluntary muscles or the autonomic nervous system or the central nervous system. The muscle tension developed by a single motor unit cannot be detected by sensory awareness, but with the feedback, we can control our instructions to the body and the conditions in the body that allow it to follow instructions. We completed our research in short order once I was convinced that the polygraph record of 7 spikes per second represented actual single motor unit firing. Surprisingly, 7 out of 21 subjects learned to produce either SMU firing or zero firing during the 20-minute period in which the imagining and relaxing trials took place. When the feedback meter was turned off prior to a new visualization, the subjects could usually maintain their low levels of muscle tension in the forearm bundle. So there was no evidence that it was necessary to have tension in the forearm in order to imagine strenuous arm activity. Another interesting finding was that only one of the subjects was able to produce single motor unit firing without the aid of electronic feedback. Presumably, after training, others might have been able to do so, but we did not test that. The one person who was able to produce single motor unit firing without feedback was myself. After I had put my arm in a state of quietness that I had learned through the meditative exercises back in the 1930s, with this experience of my own and the research data on SMU firing in the mind, I was more impressed than ever by the fact that autogenic training provided a heaviness exercise as the first step in recovering from stress problems and gaining control of muscle tension. Great quietness in the muscle system is useful in the preparation for the next step in autogenic training, in which great quietness in the autonomic nervous system is induced through the warmth exercise. We began our research on autogenic training methods in 1966. I developed a set of phrases adapted from the first and second standard exercises for relaxation and warmth, but condensed into one 15-minute exercise session. The subjects were 33 women from the local community. Each came to the laboratory for one session of guided practice and using autogenic training phrases to achieve relaxation of the whole body and warmth in the hands. The rationale for what they were about to do was explained in the following manner before practice began. It is general knowledge that our bodies are equipped with regulating mechanisms and systems that work automatically, the breathing mechanism, the circulatory system, and so forth. It is also known that such systems can be influenced by various thoughts and experiences. For example, being startled can make you catch your breath. Embarrassment may make you blush. Thinking of someone squeezing a lemon may make your mouth water. Recent research has established that it is also possible to influence such autonomic processes intentionally, volitionally, by directing physiological changes via one's focus of attention. In attempting to make a physiological change through the focus of attention, it is important to realize that it is not accomplished by force or active will. It is done by imagining and visualizing the intended change while in a relaxed state. We call this passive volition. Relaxation is important because it is easiest then to have the casual, detached, and yet expectant attitude that it is useful in bringing about the desired change. It has been found helpful to try to visualize clearly the part of the body that is to be influenced while using the autogenic phrases, which means self-regulating phrases that I will give you. In this way, a contact appears to be set up with that particular body part. This seems to be important in starting the chain of physiological, psychological events that eventuate in physiological changes. These changes essentially result in the operation of the psychophysiological principle, which affirms every change in the physiological state is accompanied by an appropriate change in the mental emotional state, conscious or unconscious, and conversely, every change in the mental emotional state, conscious or unconscious, is accompanied by an appropriate change in the physiological state. This principle, when coupled with volition, allows a natural process, psychosomatic self-regulation, to unfold. The autogenic phrases are useful in beginning practice. This idea is to visualize, imagine, and feel that the change is happening, and then just let it happen. Do not interfere with the body's tendency to cooperate. The aim is to train certain processes to cooperate in such a way that finally a very brief visualization will accomplish the intended physiological change. Several physiological processes were measured during the practice session, including respiration, heart rate, galvanic skin response, and blood flow, and temperature in the hands. One of the first things that we learned in conducting research with a large number of wires and electrodes attached to the subject was that the wiring was a major psychological handicap in learning self-regulation. A wired up subject can, constrained in the experimental chair, suffered from what we came to call the electric chair effect. In order to overcome this undesirable influence, we constructed jackets in different sizes in which 36 wires were hidden in seams, with rubber plug-in blocks sewn under the sides of the collar for head electrodes, and inside the cuffs for hand and arm electrodes. We wired the subject in a pleasant room, and afterward she walked with us to the research room. The subject could move so freely that usually she forgot about the wires. Just before she sat down, we said, "Just a second, we must plug in the jacket so we can get our records." A flexible cable led from the jacket to our recording device. The experiment could begin with a relatively comfortable subject. For research in which physiological states are being correlated with psychological states, such arrangements are useful. We have found it as important not to treat the subject as an object. After the session at our laboratory, subjects are asked to practice at home twice daily for 2 weeks. Then we had them come back for a final laboratory session during which the same physiological measurements were recorded. We were encouraged by what we learned in the study and became eager to proceed with studies combining biofeedback and autogenic training phrases. Even without biofeedback, a number of the subjects were able to relax deeply, and several of them were able to raise the temperature in their hands significantly as a result of this brief 2-week practice with autogenic training phrases. Our most interesting finding led to the use of voluntary hand warming for control of migraine headache. It came about accidentally. One of the subjects developed a migraine headache during both her laboratory sessions, brought on, she said, by fear that she would not succeed in warming her hands. During the second lab session, after an autogenic training practice, the ensuring fear and headache, we asked the subject to run through another simple test routine, which is part of the research design: to watch a small light for 10 minutes in a totally darkened, quiet room. It was very relaxing. All she had to do was touch a switch if the light appeared to move. While this was going on, I was in the instrument room studying the physiological records as they emerged on the polygraph. Suddenly, at about the ninth minute, I noticed a rapid vasodilation in both hands and a corresponding increase in hand temperature of about 10 degrees Fahrenheit in the next 2 minutes. When the test was over, I went into the experimental room and asked, "What happened to you a couple of minutes ago?" She replied, "How did you know my headache went away?" Needless to say, this startling answer raised some interesting questions. An opportunity to explore the phenomenon again occurred soon. When word of this research finding reached Lillian Petroni, the wife of a colleague in the research department, she asked if she could be trained out of a migraine. I felt it would be quite useful to try, but explained that positive results were far from certain. The principles of autogenic feedback training, which is what we call our biofeedback procedures, coupled with autogenic training phrases, were explained to Miss Petroni, and she was conducted through a 15-minute temperature feedback training session. I gave her a copy of the autogenic training phrases and one of the just completed portable temperature trainers with which to practice at home. I asked her to practice every day for a week, then phone me. She followed the training guidelines and got excellent results. After 2 weeks of practice with the meter and phrases, she had stopped taking drugs and no longer needed the machine to continue the control over migraine. She has remained free of migraine ever since, 10 years. I believe that training in inner awareness and in control of relaxation in both the striate and autonomic domains gave her the ability to turn off chronic tension in the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight system, the body's activation and alarm system, and helped her develop a more relaxed style of living in which migraine had no place. At about a month after learning to control warmth in her hands, Lillian telephoned to say she had another problem. Will temperature training cure cold feet? I suggested she use the autogenic training phrases to focus warmth in her feet. It worked immediately, and her husband stopped by my office one day to thank me for solving a long-standing family problem: his wife's need to get up 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning to warm her cold feet in a tub of hot water. Since that time, we and others working with temperature control have helped many people with their cold feet. For those who have the problem, it is no joke. Interested by the migraine finding, Joseph Sargent, director of internal medicine at the foundation, felt it would be useful to conduct a pilot study of headache patients in a clinical setting. In 1967, he began a study of temperature feedback for migraine control. Migraine headaches have been described in medical lore and in literature for 2,000 years and studied scientifically for the last 40 years. Yet no effective treatment was known. Powerful drugs have been used, but they are not effective for everyone. Their side effects are often bad, and often dosages must be increased as body adapts. It is estimated that as many as 10 million persons in the US suffer from migraine attacks. Because this type of headache poses such a difficult problem, Dr. Sargent felt that any new approach that might safely help merited study. He saw the use of autogenic feedback training to normalize blood flow as such an approach. Sargent, Green, and Walters, 1972. A vascular theory of migraine was set forth by H.G. Wolff, 1963, and his colleagues who were among the first to study migraine headaches scientifically. They concluded that it results from dysfunction of cranial arteries. First, the blood vessels of the head become unusually constricted, vasoconstriction, producing the pre-headache sickness, and then usually dilated, vasodilation, which results in the headache itself. Something initiates the process that constricts cerebral blood flow, which quite often is a response to pressure or stress. And if an adequate supply of blood to the brain is endangered, other automatic processes that control blood flow start to unfold. One of their effects is to cause blood vessels in the scalp to dilate. If this physiological response is great enough and persists long enough, biochemicals are released which produce edema and other effects that are experienced as pain. Some authorities feel that this is view of migraine, consisting of phases of vasoconstriction and vasodilation, is not basic enough. They suggest that emotional factors that modify the behavior of subcortical brain structures have a causal role in migraine headache. This last fits well with our own concept of the psychophysiological causes underlying psychosomatic disease, as will become evident in our discussion in Chapter 4 of the rationale underlying biofeedback training, how and why it works. One aspect of the general migraine syndrome, that is, the set of symptoms associated with migraine headache, is a decrease of blood in the hands. Voluntary increase in blood flow in the hands learned through temperature feedback training reflects a voluntary decrease of nervous tension. Neural firing in the sympathetic section of the autonomic nervous system. This self-induced sympathetic relaxation in the hands is apparently a reflection of relaxation in the subcortical neural center that regulates blood flow behavior throughout the body. It appears that the entire vascular system of the body tends to rebalance in response to hand temperature training, and the vascular dysfunction in the head is correspondingly correct. In other words, this undesirable vascular response to stress, the general migraine syndrome, is brought under voluntary control as a side effect of hand warming. More than 200 patients have completed Dr. Sargent's ongoing migraine control study. The standard procedure is as follows. For 1 month prior to beginning biofeedback training, each subject charts daily the type of headache, severity and duration, presence or absence of associated symptoms, and degree of disability. The patient also records the type, strength, and total number of units each medication taken in a 24-hour period, and lists any side effects associated with the drugs. Before a patient is accepted into the project, a detailed medical history is taken, a complete physical examination is given, and laboratory studies are made. In the initial session, he or she learns the use of temperature feedback trainer and the autogenic training phases for relaxation and warmth, and then takes the trainer and a typewritten copy of the phrases home with the instructions to practice daily, recording temperatures of the hand at the beginning and end of each practice period. The patients continue to keep the daily headache and medication charts during training. They are seen at weekly intervals until a consistent position response on the meter and associated awareness of warmth in the hands are achieved. Practice with the meter usually can be discontinued within a month, but daily practice without the meter continues, with the aim of learning to initiate relaxation and warmth in a few seconds to prevent or abort headaches. After training, participants return to the clinic at intervals. Pertinent data are gathered, and a refresher practice session with the temperature trainers offered. Medical follow-up continues for a minimum of 1 year and is extended whenever possible to 2 or 3 years. About 80% of the migraine headache patients have obtained relief, ranging from slight to excellent. A few have reported a migraine-free life since completing the program. Joe Sargent is an internist, and during the first 2 years of his migraine research, he and Peter Fleming, a psychiatrist, and I met each week at Joe's request to discuss problems with individual patients. For example, one of the early patients who had suffered classical migraine for many years quickly learned how to raise the temperature of her hands by as much as 25 degrees Fahrenheit, and then she apparently began to lose the skill. As she progressed with her training and got some control over her headaches, she became disturbed by the fact that she was no longer able to make such dramatic changes in hand temperature. Together, we examined her records. What was happening was clear. As she learned to meet stressful situations in a more relaxed way, her vascular system was continuously rebalancing, and her hands had begun to be warmer all the time. This was a measure of success rather than failure, but she could no longer go from 70 degrees to 95 degrees because her starting temperature had moved up to the middle 80s. Since 95 degrees or 96 degrees is close to the top, a change of 10 degrees was about as far as she could go. As her hands approached normal temperatures through her continued practice, she could expect to see less and less change on the meter. A question that is often asked about migraine patients is, how many get no benefits from hand temperature training? Experience is not uniform across the country because different clinicians have different ways of training and different systems for evaluation. In the first group of the 30 patients that Sergeant Fleming and I discussed, however, 3 quit the program without really giving it a try. The usual reason was expressed by one patient after 10 days. This program isn't going to do me any good, so I'm quitting. Interestingly enough, a specialist in speech pathology heard his patient talking with Dr. Sargent during the first visit to the clinic and told Sargent that the patient had a rigid personality, would not learn anything, and probably would quit the project. Asked how he could know all that, the doctor answered that the patient had a unilateral lisp, a speech defect that indicated a rigid personality. Speech was deformed from tension in throat muscles. If that person had stayed in the program, we might have predicted that this bad speech habit, as well as his migraine, would have changed for the better. 3 more patients, all female, learned to warm their hands in 2 or 3 weeks, began to get their migraines under control, and then lost the ability. The migraines would return in full force, and they could no longer warm their hands. We hypothesized that the initial success was due to the fact that at a conscious level, these patients wanted to get better. As soon as health improved, however, a psychological problem, one that used to be at an unconscious level, began to surface and could not be dealt with. Apparently, it was easier to have the pain of migraine than to become aware of the underlying problem that was linked to the migraine. Sargent's question to Fleming and me was whether the training program, if continued, would cause psychological problems. We concluded that so long as we reviewed the cases every week, it was in the patient's interest to persevere. These 3 patients agreed to try for a few weeks longer. And then one day, Joe phoned me about 2 of them, asking if I thought it was possible to recover from migraine in 1 week. 2 of the women had come to him individually and said they knew why they had migraine. Each said she could not put up with her husband. Both were going to get a divorce. As soon as they made that decision, Joe said, the migraine stopped and no more drugs were needed. Several months later, I learned that they had followed through and gotten divorced. The other woman in the persevering group also got control of her headaches. She came to Sargent one day and said she knew what the problem was. Her husband, a politician, often brought company home unexpectedly. Migraine was her way of handling the situation. How could he bring company home if she had an incapacitating headache? These three cases followed a pattern which has since been reported by numerous clinical researchers across the country. If a problem has a trivial cause, or a cause that is no longer of any significance in the life of the patient, the problem merely hanging on like a bad unconscious habit, it may be erased without the patient's ever becoming aware of its psychological component, its cause. It is as though unsatisfactory neural wiring is simply rearranged by the training program. How it got that way in the first place is unimportant in these cases. If the problem has a serious continuing cause, however, there is often a conflict of conscious and unconscious processes, as in the cases of women who learned how to control migraine and then lost the ability. In persevering, each suddenly became aware of the problem. Persistence drove the unconscious problem to the surface. A decision was made, and that decision terminated headaches and the need for drugs. Raynaud's disease is a vascular dysfunction characterized by reduced blood flow in the hands and feet. The smooth muscles of blood vessel walls in the extremities suffer chronic spasms, often it seems, in response to some long ago traumatic or stressful situation. In severe cases, the hands turn blue or white and are extremely painful in cold weather. If the disease progresses, deterioration of the flesh or of the fingers occur. Gangrene follows and an amputation may become necessary. No truly satisfactory and effective treatment has been developed. The drugs used to prevent vasoconstriction are powerful and have distressing side effects and are rendered ineffective by prolonged use. Sympathectomies, cutting of the sympathetic nerves leading to the diseased limb to prevent constriction of the blood vessels of necessity, are often the treatment of choice in spite of several unpleasant side effects. Amputation, sometimes necessary to control gangrene, is, of course, the last resort. Since temperature training in the hands was proving useful in the treatment of migraine, which is a vascular problem in the head, it was reasonable to suppose that it might prove useful in the treatment of Raynaud's disease. Shortly after working with Lillian Petroni, Elmer tried this technique with a woman from out of town who stopped at the research building to see us. Although her purpose in coming to Topeka was to inquire about biofeedback for headache control, she complained that she had Raynaud's disease too. Elmer asked if she would like to try the temperature trainer for her hands while at the lab, and when she answered yes, he took her through a training session. To her surprise, her hands turned from a rather dull gray blue to a normal pink color as she succeeded in warming them in the first session. That was our only contact with her, except for a letter a year later stating that her Raynaud's problem had been greatly reduced after using the autogenic training phrases. Dr. Sargent did not have time to conduct a biofeedback research project for Raynaud's disease, but he did accept a few Raynaud's patients. His assistant, Barbara Pierce, had suggested an intensive 5-day temperature training program for migraine sufferers unable to take part in the migraine research project. Barbara, a warm and dedicated young woman, met with a surprising amount of success with this 5-day training procedure and was able to include a few Raynaud's cases. One of these patients had suffered migraine headaches for many years until she was in a serious automobile accident. Then the headaches disappeared and were replaced by Raynaud's disease. When she began her treatment, all her fingertips had sores on them. She was extremely nervous, but was determined and diligent in practice. She completed her 5 days of training with a biofeedback meter and returned to her home in Iowa, with instructions to continue to practice the exercises at least 3 or 4 times a day. 3 weeks later, she wrote to Dr. Sargent and Barbara saying that Iowa had 8 inches of snow and that for the first time in years she had been able to shovel the snow from her porch. She could warm her hands almost every time she tried and believed she was doing very well, adding, "This is the first time I have been able to type in 6 years and I am ever rusty." In January, she wrote again saying that she was still progressing. that it had been 12 degrees below zero and her hands have not turned blue, not once. She also felt that she was much calmer and added, "For some reason I don't understand, I am regaining my memory." She had lost almost all recall following the accident. She told of crocheting an afghan, a sweater, and a skirt since Christmas, and ended her letter by saying, "My outlook is completely different. I really feel like a new person." This last remark is one that we and many others working in biofeedback hear frequently.